modern tank has a primitive air about it. In an age of precision-guided missiles, it seems to be a relic of a dinosaur age of land warfare. But its thick armored hide conceals its space-age ballistic computer, its laser rangefinder, and its sophisticated electronics. For all its apparent crudity, the tank has remained the dominant weapon in conventional land warfare. In this program, Video Ordnance takes a look at why tanks have survived in spite of the many sophisticated weapons arrayed against them. It will examine the many enemies of the tank, as well as the development of sophisticated new armors and technologies to protect the tank. Tanks are not the only type of armed vehicle, and we will examine the tank's many relatives. There is a combination of three qualities that distinguish tanks from other land weapons: armor, mobility, and firepower. Tanks are an amalgamation of three old forms of military power. The tank has inherited its defensive armor from castles and forts, substituting steel for stone. Horse cavalry disappeared with the appearance of the deadly machine gun, but armored vehicles have managed to take its place as an army's mobile force. For centuries, firepower came from field artillery. As in the case of the cavalry, unprotected field guns have gradually given way to tanks or artillery under armor. Tank design is a careful balance of protection, mobility, and firepower. Major Doug McGregor, a tank officer, explains tank technology.
Well, a new generation of vehicles gives us certain advantages which we didn't have 20 years ago. First of all, we're moving at much higher rates of speed than we did formerly. Secondly, our weapon systems themselves are more precise and more devastating in their impact. And then thirdly, the armor protection has improved dramatically.
From the first days of tanks in World War I, tanks have been protected by increasing amounts of steel armor. World War I tanks had about half an inch of armor, just about enough to protect against machine guns. By World War II, tanks had begun to have armor 3 or 4 inches thick, enough to protect against most artillery. As more armor was added, the tanks became so heavy they could hardly move, like this 70-ton German Royal Tiger tank. The balance between armor and mobility can become upset. The solution to this imbalance was to vary the thickness of the armor. At the front, where the tank is most likely to be hit, the armor is the thickest. At the sides, where it's less likely to be hit, it is thinner. At the rear, where it is least likely to be hit, it is very thin. Tank crews must use tactics to keep the thick frontal armor pointing like a shield in the enemy's direction. They must avoid letting the enemy fire on the thinner side and rear armor. The modern tank has steel armor about 4 inches thick at maximum. Its protective qualities are greatly increased by sloping the armor, nearly doubling its strength against most projectiles. New types of armor, such as Chobham and reactive armor, have been developed in the past 10 years. But the tank is not invulnerable, as the noted military author David Isby explains.
There is no invulnerability in the main battle tank. If you seek invulnerability, you must build a Maginot Line, because only that, in one place, under concrete, and not moving, will give you invulnerability. Of course, the Maginot Line was outflanked and defeated by light tanks of the German army, tanks which moved very fast and very far, accepting the vulnerability to win the war.
The early tanks moved no faster than a walking soldier. Their mobility and armor helped to bring about an end to the stalemate of trench warfare. The increased speed of the World War II tank was a very important factor in the new blitzkrieg tactics. Tanks like the American Sherman, the Soviet T-34, and the German Panther had a top speed of about 25 miles per hour. Tank speeds did not increase much after World War II. At higher speeds, it was impossible to aim the gun accurately, and the crew could be injured when traveling across rough terrain. New automotive technology changed all that in the 1970s. New suspension systems and more powerful engines made higher speeds possible. Tanks moving at higher speeds make a much more difficult target for enemy gunners than slow tanks. World War I tanks were armed with machine guns or small guns. They usually could fight an enemy a few hundred feet away. By World War II, tanks usually had 75mm guns, which could fire an 8-pound shell. Tanks fought each other at ranges of about 500 yards. Here we see the increase in size of tank projectiles. Modern tank guns are about 8 times more powerful than the guns used in World War II. But the real change in firepower has come about because of electronics. Until the 1960s, tanks had to stop to fire. However, in the 1970s, new ballistic computers and other electronics were developed which could compensate for the jarring motion of high-speed travel. A modern tank like the M1 Abrams, moving across country at 45 miles per hour, can now fire more accurately than an M60 tank of 1965 sitting still. And a moving tank is a much harder target to hit than a sitting one. Modern tanks are also fit with new high-tech sensors. The laser rangefinder, wind sensor, and ballistic computer make it possible for a moving tank to hit small targets 2 miles away on the first shot. The most sophisticated new electronic device on modern armored vehicles is called a FLIR, or Thermal Imaging Sight. It allows the tank crew to see at night. It works by detecting the small temperature differences between man-made objects and the natural background of earth and trees, so it can see in the dark or through haze and smoke. Until the advent of the thermal imager, tank combat usually took place in the daytime. In the future, it can take place at night as well.
I tend to see it as an advantage for all time, all day. If you come out and almost all armored vehicles are camouflaged with some type of camouflage pattern, and you pull out into an area and you want to scan the whole area, you may not see it through just a normal sight, a normal optical sight, simply because it might be camouflaged well. But if you use your thermal sights, you would tell that there's a heat source out there. The thermal sights are accurate to the point where at 2,800, 3,000 meters, approximately 2 miles, you can tell the difference between a pig, a rabbit, a human being, definitely the difference between a Jeep or a tank. So it provides an all-weather, all-day capability.
The modern tank has a 4-man crew. In the turret is the commander, the gunner, and the loader. In the front is the driver.
There is probably nothing comparable to service on a tank, particularly if you're a tank commander or a gunner, for that matter, even if you're a driver or a loader. There's a certain rush that comes with moving across open country with a large number of tanks, the air against your face, the wind blowing through your face. You have this sense of irresistible power and the sense that there's nothing out there that can stop you. Whether or not that is true, of course, is irrelevant. The point is that psychologically, when you're in a tank, you believe that you are irresistible, that you are beyond destruction. And of course, that's a tremendous psychological advantage, which means that the shock action and the impact of a tank force on the battlefield is likely to be very great because the soldiers believe in it. It's a very physically demanding duty assignment. People often forget that when it's cold on the outside, it tends to be very cold on the inside. When it's hot on the outside, it's equally hot on the inside. And when you shoot and move, you think you just went 50 rounds with Iron Mike Tyson. It is extremely demanding, and your nostrils are filled almost constantly with the stench of diesel and cordite. So I suppose from that standpoint, it is not an easy thing to do for the soldier. It's very, very tough.
There are two ways to defeat the thick armor of a tank. The traditional way is to fire a heavy projectile at it. These move so fast that they simply bash their way through the armor. This type of shell is called a kinetic energy penetrator, since it depends on the physical forces of weight and speed. It flies at nearly a mile per second and impacts with about the same force as a locomotive hitting a brick wall at 70 miles per hour. But this kind of projectile can only be fired by a large gun, like those carried on tanks. The second type of anti-tank shell is called a heat projectile, which stands for High Explosive Anti-Tank. By shaping high explosive around a cone, the explosive blast can be focused forward in a fiery jet that can blast through heavy armor by explosive pressure. These projectiles are also called shaped charge warheads. These do not depend on speed to penetrate armor, so they can be placed on very small rocket launchers that even a man can carry. These small rockets are still a deadly enemy of the tank, but are often too small and inaccurate. The real threat today comes from guided missiles with shaped charges, which are larger and more accurate. When an anti-tank missile is fired, a thin wire about as thick as a human hair spools out behind the missile. The missile crewman keeps the target tank in his sights, and radio commands are passed along the wire to correct the missile flight path in case the tank moves. These missiles can be fired from man-portable launchers, from armored vehicles, or from anti-tank helicopters. These missiles were first used on a large scale in the 1973 war in the Mideast. Israeli tank units suffered many losses to Egyptian missile units equipped with the new Soviet anti-tank missiles. But a technological answer to the shaped charge threat was desperately sought by all the major armies. The noted armor analyst Christopher Foss comments on these trends.
These types of weapons have been proliferating on the battlefield since the 1950s, and in fact some people have said that this is the death knell of the main battle tank. And in fact in the last Middle East war, the Israelis did use some tanks on the Suez Canal against against Egyptian forces equipped with RPG-7s and Saggers, and they suffered very heavy losses because the Israelis used tanks unsupported by artillery, infantry and other units, and you've got to have a combined arms team to work. Now, these types of anti-tank weapon like RPG-7, HOT and TOW all have a thing called a heat warhead, and that will penetrate conventional armour of tanks. But when a tank has the new types of trouble armour or reactive armour, that does provide a very high degree of protection over its frontal arc.
Two new armor technologies have been developed in the last decade to provide a shield against missiles using shaped charge warheads. These are called Chobham armor and reactive armor.
Chobham armor is one of the more significant innovations that came out in the 1970s. Developed by the British, it is the first change from steel armor plate that's been used on every main battle tank since the first ones in 1916. It is a composite of laminates, not only of steel, but of other materials. The composition of it still remains highly classified.
Chobham armor absorbs the terrific blast of a heat warhead before it can penetrate the main steel armor of a tank. This new Chobham armor is very effective against anti-tank missiles, but it is complicated and expensive. It is fit only to new tanks like the American M1, British Challenger, and German Leopard 2. Reactive armor is another method to defeat shaped charge warheads. The principle is quite simple. The tank is covered with small steel boxes filled with a special plastic explosive. When the box is struck by a shaped charge warhead, the box explodes. The explosion occurs so fast that it stops the shaped charge from forming properly. So instead of burning through the tank armor, the shaped charge explodes harmlessly outside the tank. The Israeli army was the first to use their version of reactive armor, called Blazer, in the 1982 war in Lebanon. It proved very successful in protecting tanks against shaped charge rockets and missiles. In 1985, the Soviet army began to put reactive armor on its tanks in Europe. With the advent of reactive and Chobham armor, the technological balance has swung back in favor of the tank. the threat posed by guided anti-tank missiles has been greatly diminished. But the technological contest between tanks and anti-tank weapons is not over.
In recent years, these new armour developments have certainly extended the life of the tank by some time. The armour, counter-armour race is going on all the time. At the moment we have got reactive armour and the missile lobby is countering it with tandem warheads and other things. But then the tank lobby will again come back the other way. So it's a race all the time between one side and the other.
The power of machine guns and artillery kept the infantrymen huddled in the muddy trenches for most of the First World War. Tanks eventually overcame artillery and machine guns. But tanks cannot exist alone without infantry support. Tanks are not very effective in city fighting, in heavily wooded areas, or in holding on to terrain. A combination of tanks and infantry has proved to be the winning solution. To give the infantry the same mobility as tanks, the armoured infantry vehicle appeared in World War II. At first, they were only intended to transport the troops up to the battlefield in safety. They were poorly armed, and the troops couldn't fight from within the vehicle. This type of infantry vehicle is called an Armoured Personnel Carrier, or APC, like the U.S. Army's M113.
The 113 was designed ultimately to be a battle taxi, to move dismounted infantry from one point to another, to dismount them so that they could then mount their attack or their defense essentially from a ground posture, not from a mounted posture. The battlefield has changed. We are now faced with much more lethal weaponry, particularly in the artillery, than we faced in the past. And we are increasingly convinced that unless you encase your infantry in almost as much steel as you do your tank crews, that they are not likely to survive for very long on the battlefield. So that today we are designing a vehicle from which the infantry can ultimately fight, as well as simply being transported around as it once was with a 113.
This new type of infantry transporter is called an IFV, for Infantry Fighting Vehicle. It is designed to permit the infantry to fight from within its protective armor.
An infantry fighting vehicle differs from the armored personnel carrier in that the infantry can fight, can use their weapons from under the armor of the vehicle. Often, these vehicles have heavier weapons that can kill tanks or other armored fighting vehicles, as well as those held by the infantrymen. Obviously, an armored fighting vehicle can move faster than infantrymen can move on the battlefield. In an infantry fighting vehicle, they cannot be killed by machine gun bullets or artillery shell fragments, which historically have been the worst killers of infantrymen. The tanks need infantry in infantry fighting vehicles so they can be up with the tanks to defeat anti-tank guided missiles, anti-tank guns, handheld anti-tank weapons that threaten the tank. Infantry, whether in armored fighting vehicles or on foot, need tanks for the same reasons they have since 1916, to destroy the machine guns that can decimate infantry. The two elements need each other very much.
IFVs have turrets like tanks, but they are not tanks. Here we see the difference between these three kinds of armored vehicles. The IFV falls between the tank and the APC. It is not as well armored, and its weapons are not as powerful as tanks, but it has thicker armor and more firepower than the old APC. The IFV and the APC carry infantry, shown here in blue. The infantry troops can dismount from the APC and the IFV and fight on foot if necessary. This new category of armored vehicles has been very controversial because they are so expensive. They are not as heavily armored as a tank, and so they have been criticized as being too vulnerable.
Well, logically, the troop carrier, as it's got to work with the main battle tank, should have better armour protection. But the only way you would do that is to have a troop carrier the same size as a Challenger or an M1, because that's the degree of protection you want, and that would be very expensive and very large, because there is a relationship between the weight of the vehicle and the end cost. I mean, you buy Bradleys, something like 7,000 of them. And if they were costing the cost of the M1, it would be a prohibitive amount.
The U.S. Marine Corps has specialized infantry vehicles. The LAV, or Light Armored Vehicle, serves the same function as the IFV, but it is wheeled instead of tracked. It is lighter than the U.S. Army Bradley and can even be carried by a helicopter. The AAV-7 is a special type of amphibious infantry vehicle designed to bring troops ashore from landing ships. It is designed to operate equally well in heavy seas or on the land. It serves the same role as the Army's APCs, but it is amphibious. The modern battlefield has become so deadly that more and more tasks are being performed by armored vehicles. The artillery has gone from towed guns to mobile armored weapons to give them protection and mobility.
The main thing is they can come into action quicker and fire their rounds on the enemy target and then withdraw before the enemy can actually detect them and actually neutralize them. I mean, there are many sensors on the battlefield, like location radars, sound ranging systems, which enable artillery to be plotted within seconds, and counter-artillery fire can come back. So you've really got to have mobile artillery systems to open fire very quickly and accurately, and then move off to another fire position as soon as possible.
Armored artillery vehicles carry either guns or artillery rockets. A single rocket vehicle, like the one seen here, can fire more high explosive in a single salvo than a dozen ordinary howitzers, and computerized land navigation systems make them more accurate than ever before possible. In spite of their armor, tanks are vulnerable to air attack. Modern armies are now being equipped with special air defense vehicles to protect tanks and infantry vehicles from air attack. These vehicles are fitted with sophisticated radars to detect and track enemy aircraft, and they are armed with rapid-firing automatic cannon. There are also missile-armed air defense vehicles like this French Roland. Their radars locate an enemy aircraft and then guide the missile towards it. If an enemy aircraft tries to bluff the radar using electronic countermeasures, the missile operator can switch to a sophisticated electro-optical sight to guide the missile. They are the most technologically complex armored vehicles, and as a result, the most expensive. But a single vehicle can protect an area of dozens of square miles. They are often nicknamed SAMs, for surface-to-air missile. SAMs have made it very risky for aircraft to attack armored units. Even the paratroopers have their own type of light tanks that can be dropped from airplanes. Here, a Sheridan light tank is dropped from low altitude on a special shock-absorbing platform. The crew of the tank parachute separately from the plane because of the enormous shocks involved.
And if we do away with the tank, what do we go back to? Trench warfare, because the tank has got mobility. It can survive on the battlefield against other types of weapons, NBC, small arms fire. And without tanks, where do you go? The tank is no longer the queen of the battlefield, but it's still got a very prominent role to play, and it will do certainly to the end of this century.
The importance of armored vehicles has prompted the development of a great many high-technology anti-armor missiles. But advances in tank armor and fire controls make it likely that armored vehicles will remain the dominant weapon in land warfare for the foreseeable future.